So here we are, Hatty. Welcome back to the podcast. You've been here before. This is not new to you. The only new thing is that this time we are going to be talking about a very difficult to read book, which is the Book of Revelation,
yes.
right? And some of the concepts in the book. But to get it all started, I think it would just be nice to talk about something on the soft side. What are some of your earliest memories of the Book of Revelation? I mean, there's so many sermons out there, there are movies, the music, and different things out there in the media. What are some of your memories of it?
You know, what's really interesting is that I have a very distinct memory of seeing some movie clips, or maybe it was a TV show, but I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
But it came back to me at this this course with Dr. Lin on Revelation and Imagination. One of the student groups was doing a book presentation on this book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. I believe it was published in, 1970, and it was also made into a movie. Basically, it's this wacky I just can't think of any better word.
I like the adjective,
of all the quote unquote prophecies in the Book of Revelation, which is the last book in the Christian kind of Protestant canon, about the so-called end times, which is when Jesus will come back and God will judge the righteous and the wicked, and basically crazy battles take place, and plagues and like destruction of the earth, and new earth comes into play, and God is like triumphant over the enemies. Like just a lot of really violent and vivid images and language of like battles and crazy monsters. Like it's a wild book, but like so the book by Lindsey, Hal Lindsey, takes all of those language and treats them as a prophecy to be fulfilled, and he somehow like interprets all of like known kind of human history and phenomena, especially the like late 60s 70s kind of political climate and the world events, interpreted through that language, and saying like all of the prophecies in the book of this revelation is coming into like fulfillment, like this is happening,
it's going to happen.
And so the movie version of that is a clip. Like there are just these scenes of like people praying, and then people being raptured, and war happening. And I remember seeing that as a kid, and I had no idea. I had zero context of what I was seeing. But it like, as like the old people would say, like it put the fear of God in me. Like, I mean, that's a scary thing to be watching for a kid, And I was like, oh my gosh, like one day, like Jesus will come back and all these wars will happen, and like the world is gonna go crazy and blow up, and people are gonna be raptured, and I was like so scared of that. But I had no idea what I was seeing, but the memory came back in this class, because when these students were doing the presentation on this book, I was like, that's what I watched when I was a kid. I had no idea. But yeah, I would say actually, besides that really crazy movie that I don't even know why or how I watched it when I was a kid, Revelation is not something that I remember being taught on or talked about that much growing up. I grew up in a pretty charismatic Korean church in the 80s and 90s, and so I'm dating myself now. And even though there were a lot of very obvious parallels to what people would describe as like fundamentalist kind of evangelical beliefs in the States, Revelation was not one of them. I don't really remember people teaching me or Sunday schools about like Jesus coming back, but I think there are some images of like heaven and
Yeah.
angels,
Uh-huh.
and like that there is some kind of, you know, judgment or like justice gonna. I think
Right.
justice maybe is the more appropriate
Right.
theme that I remember, is that basically like all the wrongs in the
Yes.
world, all the evils and the bad things that we happen like will be made right one day. Like
That's
God
right.
will make everything right one day. Like that is something that resonated, but
Yes.
not so much of the crazy themes.
Right.
Yeah.
I think my experience is also kind of similar to yours. The only difference is that I guess for me growing up in a similar background as you, the emphasis on heaven and hell was tied to living a good life and, you know, not living a sinful life, you know, as it would be described, because living a sinful life has consequences at the end of life, right? When everything that is described in Revelation as prophecy happens, because you did not live the life that you were supposed to live, like you didn't do good, then you will not go to the place where good people go to, namely heaven. And you know, it's tied into the heaven and hell kind of message is what I'm saying.
See.
And then there was also a huge emphasis on the Antichrist, right?
Oh, interesting.
It's also tied into like politics. And I grew up in Ghana, you all. So, you know, even though we were in Ghana, we were looking beyond the country and thinking of the Antichrist as this political figure who would do all the bad things. Like, you know, at some point, like Obama was the Antichrist. At some point, it was George Bush. At some point, it was something else, right? Just
Sure.
anybody who would do something that the culture within which I was
the
would not
communists.
consider as,
Yeah.
you know, this is what we don't expect of this person to do. And then the person is likely the Antichrist. And then, you know, this like,
Interesting. So do you actually remember being taught, like from the pulpit, people preaching?
this is all
on
street. This is all street.
Antichrist?
Like,
okay.
this is all street like comments. I guess like from the pulpit, it was more in the movies. Like you know, the Left Behind movie was shown, you know,
really?
in youth group, and and everybody will watch it, and it's a way of putting the fear of God, like you said, in the hearts of the youth, so that they would do the
Interesting.
right thing, right? They
I
would
see.
live
So
the wrong way.
it's actually more of like, oh, you don't want these things to happen to you, so
Yes.
like listen to your parents.
Listen to your parents.
Go to
right?
church.
Go to church.
I
Or
see.
when you go on the street and you evangelize the people, then you need to tell them of like, you know, the terrors that are going to happen at some point. So my experience was that.
Super interesting. And then it makes me kind of think about how it's not so much the actual words in Revelation that we are dwelling upon, but the kind of the force behind the language, the images. So namely for you, that's this idea of heaven and hell, or like a retribution,
Yes.
doing the right thing so that you will not be punished.
Exactly.
But not exactly like you reading
Not
the
exactly you
book
reading-
and trying to understand like what is the beast, like who
Yeah,
is this
the horses
person,
and the
or the
lamb
horses.
and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
seals and the
Yeah.
you know, all of that. No, nobody really cared about that in my context.
And that's hard because like it is a really, I don't know, phenomenal book. Like not that other parts of the Christian Bible, you know, aren't also like very vivid and has
Yeah.
like a lot of imagery and really rich visuals, but Revelation, I think, is one of the most like densely image driven, and a lot of allusions, if you will, to also the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, a lot of prophetic language, but it's not something that you may like readily pick up unless you're like reading it slowly, reading it very carefully.
Yep.
And then, so I guess my thought / question is like, if people aren't actually reading it
Yeah.
and they're not actually thinking about what's in the book, but how the book becomes like more of an icon, like how the ideas or things, images associated with the book are being
Yeah.
used, like how do you see that Like, is that part of the Bible? Like, we call that reception, right? But like,
yeah, we call it reception.
Yeah, is that part of the Bible?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's part of the interpretive process that people adopt. Right? They're not reading the lines, the very lines and sentences and the content of the book of Revelation, but they're picking up on and extracting from it tangential ideas and themes that resonate with other parts of the book, right? Or other parts of the Bible, for instance, like heaven and hell concept, right? I'm not too sure where exactly in Revelation the specific ideas of heaven and hell and how that is tied to the concept of retribution shows up in the book of Revelation, but somehow, like, you know, it is tied into the concept of the end of the nations and the end of the world, which is something that comes up in the book of Revelation. And, you know, so I guess for me, I see it as like a part of the interpretive process that people in different cultures and traditions sort of adapt, right?
That's also interesting because technically, I might be wrong, but like there is no in the Hebrew Bible tradition, like there is no such thing as heaven.
No.
There is Sheol where people go, dead people go.
Yeah.
But it's not anything like what we see with like eternal fire and you know, sulfur and smoke coming out. Like it's nothing like that in Revelation. And in the Gospels, Jesus talks about Gehenna, and it's also the idea of like some kind of fiery torment, and there's a separation of, you know, good people and bad people maybe, but like that's not something very specifically spelled out in other parts of the Bible. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is like Revelation itself is an interpretation of the themes, as exactly what you were saying, themes and concepts and ideas from other parts of the textual traditions.
That's right.
And making his own. And I wonder if you would be willing to say some things about like how do you see from Ghanaian perspective, and I know you're right now studying a lot about like Africana studies and indigenous kind of like epistemologies, and like do you have anything you want to share about how you see the themes in Revelation being read in African context?
Yeah. Again, this is also on the tangent. It's not like something that explicitly comes up in the book of Revelation, but as far as Revelation is associated with concepts of death and the afterlife and the end of life, different African traditions and philosophies, you know, view death and the afterlife in different ways. For instance, in the Akan context, there is the concept of Asamando, which is the place where the spirit of the dead goes, right? It's actually conceived as a place, but it is not necessarily, when you compare that to the Christian concept of heaven and hell, it's not necessarily conceived as, you know, a separate place for good people and bad people, but it's a place where the spirit of all the ancestors go to. And of course, there is this sort of moral, ethical division between like, you know, dead people that did good and dead people that did bad. But the punishment that they get is sort of inscribed into the burial rites that they all experience, like how you bury good people and how you bury bad people. So like, you know, because most African traditions believe in a concept of like reincarnation or rebirth, that's when you go to be with the ancestors, at some point you are going to be reborn, right? You're going to come back and, you know, live among the living again, right? And that's even tied to, you know, the way people they call it birth marks, right? When they give birth to people, they give them birth marks, or they give them like tribal marks or something like that. You know, it has cultural dimensions to it, but it has also like, you know, something to do with what will happen if that person dies. And when the person comes back and you see similar marks on them, like, oh yeah, this person.
That's
like,
how you identify.
That's how you recognize the person who was here before and, you know, died and then is back, right? Back to my concept about like burial rites and practices and funeral practices, because we don't want the bad person to come back the way they are buried is basically in a way that is shameful. Like we sweep after them with a broom, with a traditional broom, right? In a very shameful ritualistic way,
like
so
casting
that
them out,
casting them out, so that they feel so ashamed that they don't want to be part of this place again. They don't want to come back again, and so they go in and they stay there. And then the good ones have like, you know, very pleasing and nice burial, and you know, in a way that is welcoming of them after they come back. So it's all of that really rough.
But do people who then those who have died and come back, they come back to inhabit like this world? So it's not an otherworldly concept.
No, it's not an otherworldly concept. It's a belief that they come back and, you know, maybe in different ways, slightly different ways, but they come back and inhabit this actual world. So in a sense, the world never really ends. I guess that's the point that I'm going to, right? In the sense, the world never really ends. The world is an ongoing process, and it's inhabited by people who come and then go, and they are reborn, and then they come back again.
I find the lack of otherworldliness really fascinating, because I had always thought that was a just essential part of any religious system, that you believe in some like otherworldly spiritual realm.
There is that belief in the Akan tradition. That, you know, there is the belief that there is a spirit world. For instance, there is the belief that there's a world that is different from the world that like we live in as mortal beings. There is that concept, but you know, there's also slight tension between that world and the concept of the end of this world. Right? Yeah.
I think that's what I was trying to get.
Yes.
It's that because in the system of reincarnation,
yes,
as you were saying, like I think that phrase really stuck out to me. Like there is no end.
Yes.
That this world continues on with the souls of the departed who come back and re-inhabit, and the cycle kind of goes on. So the time is not really linear.
Yes.
There is circularity.
Yes.
And an ongoing of this world, which then it brings me back to this idea of apocalypse that is present in Revelation. One of the articles that we read for the course that I was in, it's Telling Times for Asian America by I can't say his name right, but that's Young Benyu Liu. I apologize. Does touch on that concept a little bit of like lack of or I guess like a non-linear time.
Yeah.
And I know there are other scholars who kind of think about this.
Yeah.
That like what's really attractive and also really strange about the apocalypse, which actually doesn't really mean end of the world. I don't think I actually knew that until more recently either. It's just a Greek word for revelation or revealing. And more on that later. But is that like the fact that it is talking about like this like cataclysmic event that like is end of all things as we know it, sounds like end of the world, because it is as we know it, the world as we know it, but technically the world does not end, in the sense that like there is New Jerusalem, there is new heaven and new earth, and it's not like all of the souls have disappeared, even the ones who were raptured or wherever they went, right? Like all the people are back in a way, like whether it's in their new bodies or whatever, and there's continuity, right? And so it's like a rupture in time, and kind of breaking of time as we know it, but it's not an end. And I think even for, I guess there are so many interesting things there. Like two things, I don't know how they're related, but that I want to mention what you said is like one, the fact that like for traditional, as I understand it, like Jewish thought, or as I was mentioning in the Hebrew Bible, there is no concept of like another realm. Like again, there is Sheol, but so much of like the relationship God has with Israel and all of kind of interactions with the divine is this world. It's not about some other realm, utopia, good or bad, where like at the end of life you go somewhere and then that's when the real life begins. Like that does not exist in the Hebrew Bible. It is very this world, right? Whereas like I think the kind of like what we understand as evangelical teachings like has like the Western Christianity has very much of this dichotomy of like this world, it's body, and then some other world and like soul and or spirit, eternity. Like there is this weird duality happening. Like that's I find that interesting that like you don't really see that in like an indigenous African thinking, but also that's also not in the Hebrew Bible. But then Revelation seems to play that, and it has become something else. The other thing that I wanted to mention is on the like just the non-linearity of time, like or the rupture of time actually. Maybe it is related because the whole. I think in a way the duality that I was describing, like the dichotomy of this world, the other world, like body and then soul over there, like it works because in that concept time is linear. Like it is from like there is a very definitive beginning and then there's a very definitive end, and then time is going one way and it's everything in history is like going towards that end.
Indeed,
whereas for I don't know, like another scholar who was really kind of like thought-provoking for me was Jacqueline Hidalgo, who came to speak to it was a little bit different context. She was talking specifically about like Chicano context, but like she was basically putting it out there that like, you know, this utopia or end of the world, it's for those who have survived apocalypse. Like the end of the world has already happened for some, but we are still alive. As she was talking about children of the apocalypse, right? The ones who have like indigenous African folks. So one example, like a lot of the global South like have experienced colonialism and and that was an end of world as we know it for those folks, but the world didn't end in that they also have survived, and so there's this like rupture in time and a completely different world has emerged, but it's not but there's still continuity and there's still life, and I find that I find all these like tensions really interesting.
I think it's something that I would say also exists in some African epistemologies as well, because John Mbiti, who did his PhD in New Testament at Oxford very long time ago, wrote his whole dissertation on this exact same thing, like the non-linearity of time in the Akamba of Kenya context, right? And he did this in comparison with the book of Revelation, and he sort of talked about exactly the same thing that you're talking about, right? So I guess like we learn a lot when we look at how other people conceive of time and how Western evangelical traditions also conceive of time, especially as they see it in the book of Revelation. And you really did a good job by outlining like the tensions between that, because for many people it's ended, like the end of the world is ended, like in different ways and at different points, but this life keeps going on, right? And we're still living, and that's how it has been for most people.
It just reminds me that the text, like ancient texts like Revelation and the Bible that we study, have still so much to offer, like after 2,000 plus years of like studying, like that there's still ways that people read and find meaning or interpret and make sense of it based on context.
And
where we come from. And
text and context, right?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I'm kind of beating the dead horse there about reception history, but
Should we talk about something else that is also very interesting?
Yes. Interesting is an understatement, but okay. Fire away.
Which is the sort of thinking about apocalypse in Gaza, right? And you definitely know that we cannot talk about the rhetorical and political use of the Book of Revelation without mentioning what's going on in Israel right now between Israel and Hamas. And how do you see the language of domination and militarism and violence in the battle scenes getting co-opted by the religious right in the U.S. context, for example?
Whew, okay.
Big question, right?
Oh, man. Yeah, but I thank you. That's such an important question. I want to, put a disclaimer that, it is a really big topic and we can't avoid it in a way. I actually tried, but I don't think I can. But we want, at least in this episode, we want to focus on, or I'm trying to be conscious of talking more specifically about the rhetorical use of the language derived from the Book of Revelation, and not comment so much on the state of Israel and Palestinian rights, and I'm gonna try to stay a little bit away from the political conversation.
That's fair.
But also, in a way, politics is very much part of, as we were saying, context and how we read texts like this. And I think for those of us who are studying biblical material, can attest that of all the ways that at least recent history in my memory of how recent world events and world conflicts have come up, that there is a long history of violence that is perpetrated by people who use and weaponize and interpret, and sometimes maybe without even really thinking, read and use the text. But that we are in a way complicit. And so I at least for me, I think this war has really highlighted that for me, and what, in a way, whether I like it or not, kind of the ethical responsibility that falls on scholars like us. Okay, so caveat aside, what was really interesting was that I was curious throughout the course, even before the October attack, how some terms that we throw around, Armageddon or end times or anything like that, would come up in the internet search. And actually I was thinking completely differently about what might come up, and I was really obsessed with the movie Oppenheimer. And so I was thinking about would the images of the war, World War things, World War II, the bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and especially because the movie has brought it to our recent attention again, thinking about kind of a nuclear age and the horror of that man-made destruction and apocalypse. Would that have any influence on how people are thinking about Revelation? So that was my initial interest. And I did a Google search on some of the keywords. And I should not have been surprised, but I was blown away that basically when I looked up end times, apocalypse, Revelation, and I went to Google Analytics, all these search terms were, they were kind of somewhere along the line, people were interested in them, but on the week of October 8th and 14th, they jumped up like 100 to like almost 3,000%. And the related search words that come up with like Revelation, Israel war, Jesus revolution, the 144,000 and signs of the apocalypse are like, going up the chart. Like, people are looking for them and they're curious. And I guess this brings up more questions than it answers, but what it got me thinking is that, like, kind of even going back to what we were talking about with late great planet Earth and like Left Behind series in the beginning, like how much of like the images from the book of Revelation are so powerful in like the cultural imagination, and that like in times of crisis, that these were like keywords or ideas, or again, like because most people are not going to actually read the word. Like people are not going to actually read the Bible, even though I really want us to. But these become readily usable or like adaptable somehow. By whoever wants to use very powerful image and language for their own means and needs. And there's something about the battles and the kind of triumphant nature of like, God's righteous judgment, like, Jesus coming back like a lamb, like kind of coming back with his like vengeance and, basically, redeeming all the martyred or the kind of Christian persecuted kind of people who have done right and avenging on his enemies, and killing a lot of living things, like destroying the world so that the new world can come about. Like, there's something really powerful about that. And it's like, I think it's not hard to just like look at when you just like search. I don't know, I think I put in that Revelation war in Israel, and like there hundreds of blog posts by, I think most of them I can kind of tell by looking at their title, that like harvest.org or like godquestions.org or like livingwaters.org. Like these are kind of like probably Christian inspired websites, but talking about like what role does Israel play in the end times. Like what does the war mean for the Christians who are like waiting for a return of Jesus, right?
You drew my attention a lot to the pandemic, and you remember the middle of the pandemic, there were a lot of conspiracy theories around what COVID actually is, and somehow themes like exactly what we've talked about were sort of rhetorically associated with the pandemic. And I'm sure there were thousands of blogs out there saying things like, this is the sign of the end, this is the sign of the coming of Christ, this is the doing of this is the doing of the Antichrist. And there's all these like sort of ideologies around. But I guess my point is, there's something about people experiencing crises, right? Or something happening, something as terrible as war happening, and then a lot of people want to make meaning out of that. And one of the ways that they sort of find meaning is to associate it with some of the themes that we see in Revelation, or the end of the world, or the end of time, or something like that, right? There's something about the way people process difficulty and crises, and read it as being a part of whatever that has to do with the end of the world.
It's interesting that you mentioned COVID. I hadn't thought about that, even though actually that was I think 1 week in the course reading, we did talk
Oh,
about
you did talk about COVID? Okay.
yeah, like disease, plagues,
Yes.
and the kind of like undesirable elements that the Revelation actually does have a little bit of that like purity language. Of like those who are unclean cannot enter the New Jerusalem, and what was I gonna say about that? Like the language around like almost like hygiene, right? Like whether it's ritual or maybe even like ethical, morally, like purity, and the like disease, then the plague, then the undesirable kind of elements who are then associated with people.
That's right.
It's really, again, like those are elements. It's not really spelled out in Revelation that way, but like it gets used, it gets picked up, and it gets used in immigration conversations, for example.
Right.
Whether it's like the Chinese Exclusion Act or kind of like the way we talk about Mexicans crossing the borders in the South. Like these are like people who that from the perspective of like America as the New Jerusalem, like we do not want these people for XYZ, and they carry disease or like they bring kung fu virus or whatever, that kind of language, right? And so again, like how much does the image and concept and language in Revelation like carry so much power and potency to be readily used? And then this brings me to the last thing that you were saying about people in crisis. And the one of the books that we read is called The Crisis and Catharsis by Adele Yarbrough Collins.
That's a familiar name,
it's a very familiar name. The classic book on Revelation, talking about. She's talking mostly about the actual context of the book being written. Thinking about like whether there really was a widespread Christian persecution, and for those like Jewish Christians and also those Gentile Christians like in Asia Minor, like kind of thinking about like under Roman Empire, like what would it mean for people who are perceiving that they are in crisis to like respond to that crisis, and that apocalypse as a genre like provides, as you were saying, like a way to like make meaning out of threat or and I guess this brings me to another question / thought, like on like how, so is it a good thing? I know I'm like putting it a really good black and white, very like simple question, binary question, but like to have a readily available language and image and ideas like from the book of Revelation that people can use, I guess, to cope with crisis or to make sense of uncertainties. But the way they do that, or the way the book does that, is really by giving you a very stark black and white and binary kind of world, right? Like where it's you're either good or bad. You're either the saved or not. You're either with God or like against God. You're either gonna be saved or be destroyed. Like you're either the chosen ones or or you're like the undesirables, right? Like there are all these like very rigid binaries, and it's in a way maybe very like satisfying to have like such like clear-cut answers, and also at the end, like for the ones that are undesirable and that you don't want your enemies like to be destroyed in such like a violent way.
That's
like,
right.
And they revel in it. There's so much like reveling language of like you watch the fall of Babylon, you watch like the enemies be tortured and burned forever. Like you smell the smoke, like you see the slain bodies. Like there's so much like rejoicing over these like violent imageries. And so like how useful is it to have a book like this, and how do you read it?
I tell you, it just it's similar to like how do people experiencing suffering think of the fall of empire, really, right?
Ooh, say more.
How do they do, like, if you're experiencing suffering caused by empire and then the empire falls, how do you respond to it? With rejoicing, right? Indeed. So in some way, I think these concepts that you are bringing up, for me, they, like, for a person or a people that are experiencing suffering or experiencing colonization or, all the legacies of imperialism or whatever, like, all the terrible things that empire does, the ideas of victory over that, over the enemy, over empire, ideas of, there's the concept of, like, the white horse, and then the lamb sitting on the white horse, and then, slaying, beheading, I think something about the enemy, like, Revelation 19 or something like that. I don't remember clearly. But, I think as I look back even on some of the sermons that I had in church, there's something about, this is the moment where all of us are going to experience the culmination of all victories, like the victory of all victories. And and here it is, like, it's right here in the book of Revelation, that there's going to be a moment where there's no more suffering because this Son of Man is coming dressed in white and is ready to fight the enemy, right? It's ready to put an end to all evil and all suffering. There's something about that, but that's from the perspective of the sufferer, someone who is like the people experiencing the thing, right? And I wonder what it would look like to nuance that a lot more, right? So that's a really good question. I wonder what you think about that, Hatty.
I do want to, add more nuance to that.
Yeah.
And I do want to come back to what you were saying about from the perspective of suffering peoples, because I think that has everything to do with how we answer, is like about perspectives, right? Okay. But one of the, I think, sharp critiques of on the book of Revelation, I mean, there are so many things to critique, but
a book like this, of course,
yes, as is the rest of the Bible, but as you were saying, the language of victory, and I think I've also mentioned it in the beginning of the episode when I was talking about God's justice, when all the wrongs will be made right, and you're right, like, there's something so powerful about that, and that it gives people hope, and ways to kind of cope and make sense of their own world and have more agency, and the whole, like, I want to say Brian Blount was one of the readings that we did, called "Can I Get a Witness?" and kind of looking at Revelation as like a way to for African Americans, especially like someone, I believe he's like also kind of familiar with and trained in like liberation theology and Black liberation theology, thinking about like for those on the suffering side, right? Like people who have experienced extreme violence and loss of freedom, and degradation and loss of dignity, like for people like that, like in the Black community, to see this book as a way to resist the powers that be, resist the empire, and is a way of like witnessing, which is a very powerful thing.
It is.
And at the same time, like thinking about like what does it mean then for, you know, in Revelation, when John clearly sees the I guess purported author, John, seeing like all these things and saying like, you know, I speaking from very like a perceived marginalized community of Christians living under Roman Empire, and critiquing the empire, and seeing the fall of the empire and rejoicing, for someone in that community to then basically take on all of the attributes of the empire that made Rome so terrible.
Oh my God, yeah.
Right? Like in dominating over their subjects, and, you know, destroying and reveling in the torture and like, you know, slaying of their enemies and conquering language. That's basically all of what the lamb and the lion does.
Yes.
And creating a new world order, exactly like the one that they just defeated. And so like, yeah, that makes me ponder. And I think a lot of African American, even like someone like Chantel Smith, or actually, yes, like thinking about like from the womanist and feminist perspective, then like is it okay that we talk about freedom and justice, but through the language of violence that is like basically taking on the imperial role and like subjugation of women, right? Like I think that's honestly, that was one of the questions that I had. I'm like,
I hear you.
Is revolution and is, you know, change that we need to right the wrong and like the make justice happen for the sufferers, like does that always then require violence? Like is that just a human condition? And what does the Bible say anything about that?
It's like, where at the end of the day the sufferer is not any different from empire, because the sufferer wants and becomes the empire, only that this time the difference is they were suffering before, right? So it's like you take on all the tools and the methods of empire to overcome, and then yay, we got it. But you know, you got it exactly the same way that you were also.
Isn't there a term for that?
I think there is. There should be. Because it's not like it's not a concept that is only in Revelation. I see it in a lot of texts that also have empire embedded within them, right? Because usually when the persecuted, well, maybe not the persecuted, but when the subject protests for freedom, then it's like the desire is to be free ultimately, but also to be free in what way, right? To be as free as the emperor, right? To become like the emperor indeed. So it's a repeated concept in several different texts. And because of that, I should think that there is a name for it. I don't know what the name is, but it's a really interesting concept that you put out here, right? Is should restoration come through the same means as imperialization?
Yeah, and I don't think Revelation gives us any
straightforward
answer, except the end where everybody's, you know, every nation tongue and tribe come in and like rejoicing.
Maybe let's end on that note as well, and so that it is also encouraging to other listeners who have been listening to us in the last 40 minutes, and we are just talking about all of the difficult parts of Revelation. But there's also the theme of like every nation rejoicing and singing and you know, coming together and all of that. Like there's something nice about that, right? I guess so.
And I think it is a good way to end, because then maybe this will be like, okay, go read the book for yourself. Go read Revelation and tell me if you think it belongs in the Bible.
Oh my God. Yeah. What a wonderful project, Hattie. Thank you.
Thank you. This was fun.
Coming through and sharing your project with us. And we wish you all the best in other projects that you're doing. And then hopefully you come back and share more things with us.
Yay, more fun books. The Bible is endless. Thank you.
Awesome.